dears, welcome to study with Master Notes. How are you all? I think all are fine. Okay students, we will start Unit 10, the critical perspective of American literature. Okay, here it is Block 2, Unit 10 of Scarlet Letter written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Okay, so we will start the critical perspective. Hope you will watch the video till end. Keep patience. I will describe all things bit by bit and you will get some notification about your upcoming exam. Okay, so students, let's start Unit 10, critical perspective. What is the structure? Here it is: objectives, introduction, 19th century response, modern response, contemporary response. Let us sum up glossary or selected bibliography. Okay, so what is the objectives? As I earlier told in my units, that is every unit has its own objectives. So what is the objectives? Our primary objectives in this unit is to give you an idea of the shifting critical responses to the Scarlet Letter from the 19th century to the contemporary time. A classic like the Scarlet Letter has been interpreted differently in different times. Okay, then introduction. In 19th century, it was Henry James, himself a distinguished American master of fiction, who set the tone of a qualified approval of the Scarlet Letter. On the one hand, James admired the work as an authentic portrayal of New England Puritanism in all its specific color. On the other hand, he was also critical of its excessive allegory and symbolism and an absence of realism that was so triumphant all over Europe. Even major realist novelists like Anthony Trollope and William Dean Howells admired the tragic intensity of the Scarlet Letter, but could not really understand why Hawthorne could lean so heavily on the fantastic, the supernatural, the symbolic, and the allegorical, and yet create a sense of truth as strong as in any realistic novel. The Scarlet Letter, a reading by Nina Baim, page number 14. Then, it was, however, a 20th century critic like Richard Chase who could differentiate Nathaniel Hawthorne from the realistic writers of the novel in the 19th century and describe the Scarlet Letter as a romance or a romance novel. That is a novel with a strong element of romance, supernatural, and the marvelous. So here is the question arises: who said the Scarlet Letter as a romance or a romance novel? Here you can say the answer is Richard Chase. Okay, here is the answer is Richard Chase. Okay, so you can say here it is the answer is Richard Chase. Here is the answer is Richard Chase. Then F.O. Matthiessen was another important 20th century critic who could discern a formal coherence and unity in the sequencing of the three scaffold scenes in the Scarlet Letter. D.H. Lawrence was a radical critic and thinker who could see a kind of duplicity in the romantic tale, in which the celebration of passion nearly destroys the world of pity that the Puritanic imagination of the writer has so meticulously created. Okay, so in the Scarlet Letter, the three scaffold scenes are there. D.H. Lawrence was a radical critic and thinker. So who was a radical critic and thinker? You can write the answer is D.H. critic. Okay, here the answer is D.H. critic. D.H. critic is a D.H. Lawrence. Sorry, D.H. Lawrence as a radical critic and thinker. Okay, so D.H. Lawrence. Okay, D.H. Lawrence. Lawrence is a radical critic and thinker who could see a kind of duplicity in the romantic tale in which the celebration of passion nearly destroys the world of pity that the Puritanic imagination of the writer has so meticulously created. Then, the contemporary critics like Michael Dune, Sackvan Berkovich, Charles Swan, and Nina Babb look at the Scarlet Letter as an open-ended text in which there is a recurrent dialogue between the past and the future, while the Puritan utopia that was established in mid-17th century New England with so much hope is sharply negated by the thrust of the narrative. A kind of feminist utopia is obliquely visualized by the narrator. Okay, here it is in the Scarlet Letter. There is a Puritan utopia, and you can add a kind of feminist utopia obliquely visualized by the narrator. Okay, the contemporary critics told that is by Michael Dune, Sackvan Berkovich, Charles Swan, and Nina Bayam, Baym, Nina Bayam. Okay, then 19th century response. The Scarlet Letter, according to Nina Bayam, in the Scarlet Letter, the reading was recognized as a classic even before publication. The original intention of Hawthorne had been to publish the work as a loose collection of short tales. It was James T. Field, one of the three partners in the firm that published Hawthorne's works, who read the manuscript and urged the hesitant author to publish it as a single work. Field agreed with Hawthorne that the work was not a mixture of bright and dark, sunshine and shadow, humor and pathos, as the taste of the time preferred. In reality, Hawthorne's tale was a product of his brooding imagination and was intense and single in its trace on the dark, the somber, the gloomy. Herman Melville, the author of the Moby Dick, also referred to Hawthorne's brooding, melancholy imagination. This great power of blackness is derived from the Calvinistic sense of innate depravity and original sin, from whose visitations in some shape or other no deeply thinking mind is always and wholly free. That is Richard Chase, page number 89. After its publication, various critics responded to the Scarlet Letter in different ways, while admitting that it was a most powerful but painful story. Henry Corley drew our attention to the fantastic and the supernatural in the tale, the touch of the fantastic befitting of period of society in which ignorant and excitable human creatures conceived each other and themselves to be under the direct rule and governance of the wicked one is most skillfully administered. The supernatural here never becomes grossly palpable. The thrill is all the deeper for its action being indefinite and its source vague and distant. Critics on Hawthorne ed Thomas J. Rowntree, that is page number 18 to 19. What Henry Corley suggested was that the use of the fantastic and supernatural was done in a most judicious and artistic manner in order to bring out the strange life in mid-17th century New England in all its primitive and specific particularity. In other words, it was the use of the fantastic and supernatural that made Hawthorne's somber romance authentic and credible. Leslie Stephen also drew attention to the use of the marvelous in Hawthorne's romance. In fact, Hawthorne was able to trade in that magic circle of the marvelous only by an exquisite refinement of taste and by a delicate sense of humor, which is the best preservative against all extravagance. Anthony Trollope was a major Victorian writer who wrote novels in the realistic mode. So, who was a major Victorian writer? Here you can say the answer is the answer is Anthony Trollope is a major Victorian writer. Okay, the answer is Anthony Trollope. Okay, Anthony Trollope. Here it is a major Victorian writer. The novels in realistic mode. He was, however, perceptive enough to discern the Hawthornes. The Scarlet Letter belonged to an altogether different tradition of fiction. The creations of American literature generally are no doubt more given to the speculative, less given to the realistic than are those of English literature. But in no American writer is to be found the same predominance of weird imagination as in Hawthorne. It is the strange and brooding imagination of Hawthorne that enabled him to look at the institutions and individuals of mid-17th century New England from the perspective of an outsider. In this, however, there is a streak of that satire with which Hawthorne always picks up the peculiar institutions of his own country. The worthy magistrates of Massachusetts are under his lash throughout the story, and so is the virtue of her citizens and the chastity of her matrons, which can take delight in the open shame of woman whose sin has been discovered. Indeed, there is never a page written by Hawthorne not tinged by satire. It was Henry James who made an attempt to include Hawthorne in the canon and described him as the foremost American master of fiction. To talk of his being national would be to force the note and make a mistake of proportion. But he is, in spite of the absence of the realistic quality, intensely and vividly local. Henry James could notice the paradox of Hawthorne's fictional art. There is an absence of realism, that is, an elaborate and comprehensive depiction of incidents of everyday life. Okay, so Henry James could notice the paradox of Hawthorne's fictional act. So who noticed the paradox of Hawthorne's fictional art? Here it is, the answer is Henry James. Okay, could notice the paradox of Hawthorne's fictional art. There is an absence of realism, that is, an elaborate comprehensive depiction of incidents of everyday life, and yet the Scarlet Letter could present the life of colonial New England in all its starkness and specificity. It is Hawthorne's ability to evoke the life and folk beliefs of the city of Boston in colonial New England that made him the foremost American writer of his time. It is true that Henry James was critical of the absence of realism in Hawthorne, and he also lamented the excess of allegory and symbolism in the unfolding of the narrative. He also suggested, like Anthony Trollope, that he is to a considerable degree ironical. This is part of his charm, part, even one may say, of his brightness. But he is neither bitter nor cynical. He is rarely even what I should call tragical. It is reader's inability to perceive the irony in Hawthorne's narrative art that makes the tale appear so morbid and gloomy. True, there is gloom and melancholy as the plot of the Scarlet Letter is unfolded, but it is to some extent countered by the narrator's irony and skepticism. Even in the most intense scene, for example, the last scaffold scene, the note of irony is unmistakable. Then modern response. It was in the 20th century that Scarlet Letter was seen as a product of native tradition of American fiction. Richard Chase suggested in the American novel and its tradition that romance rather than the novel was the predestined form of American narrative. A romance was preoccupied more with the marvelous and the supernatural, but it also was faithful to what Hawthorne himself described as the truth of the human heart. F.O. Matheson looked at the Scarlet Letter in terms of the structure of a tale that had a symmetry of design. This symmetrically resulted from the sequencing of the highly dramatic scenes near the scaffold of the pillory where all the major characters were present. These scenes were located at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the tale, that is Norton Critical Edition of the Scarlet Letter, page number 279. In other words, there was a classical unity of design in the structure of romance designed by Hawthorne. While keeping in mind the modernist temper, F.O. Matheson focused attention on the structure of the Scarlet Letter and the importance of the three scaffold scenes. Wyvern Winters laid stress on the strange nature of the fiction created by Hawthorne. He said in the Scarlet Letter, then Hawthorne created a great allegory. Or if we look first at the allegorical view of life upon which early Puritan society was based, we might almost say that he composed a great historical novel. Critics on Hawthorne, a critic like Charles Fiddleson Jr. was of the view that allegory and symbolism were often in conflict in the Scarlet Letter. He said the symbolistic and the allegorical patterns in Hawthorne's books reach quite different conclusions, or rather, the symbolism leads to an inconclusive luxuriance of meaning, while allegory imposes the pat moral and the simplified character. We have already told you that the Scarlet Letter A is initially visualized as the badge of a sinful woman, but later on it becomes a re-symbol of a noble nun and a compassionate woman. In other words, while allegory has a more or less definite meaning, a symbol has a host of associations clinging to it. It has a critic like Q.D. Lewis, who could look upon Hawthorne as a poet rather than an allegorist. And if much of Hawthorne's writing is allegorical, it is in the manner of Shakespeare, the Shakespeare of the tragedies, each of which may be regarded as an expanded metaphor, rather than in the style of Spenser, Milton, or Bunyan. Collected Essays, Volume 2, Cambridge University Press, 1985, page 3. The difficulty of a final interpretation of the Scarlet Letter arises from the symbolical and metaphoric density of the text. The difficulty of a final interpretation of the Scarlet Letter arises from the symbolical and metaphoric density of the text. In her celebrated essay, Hawthorne as Poet, Q.D. Lewis looks upon Hawthorne as a leading cultural critic of his time. She says Hawthorne was writing a kind of mythic prophecy about the great cultural change involved in the shift from the old world to the new. Richard Chase, page 75. It has to be noted that both Hester and Dimmesdale had eventually planned to escape to the old world, but later on they changed their plan and stuck to the new world. D.H. Lawrence was a radical thinker who could see in Hawthorne a tight mental allegiance to a morality which all their passion goes to destroy. What D.H. Lawrence was suggesting is that there was a split in Hawthorne's mind. He was both a Puritan like Dimmesdale and a pagan like Hester. Okay, D.H. Lawrence was suggesting is that there was a split in Hawthorne's mind. He was both a Puritan like Dimmesdale and a pagan like Hester. The Scarlet Letter was both a drama of sin and redemption and a celebration of romantic love. It could be read from the sacred perspective, and it could also be read simultaneously from a secular perspective. Okay, so it is dual in nature. It could be read from sacred perspective and it could also be read simultaneously from a secular perspective. Then contemporary response. So Rita K. Goldin has laid stress on daydreams that Hester has in the first scaffold scene and Dimmesdale has during the second scaffold scene. At midnight, the reverie or daydream helps them to come to terms with the consequences of their sexual encounter. Okay, so here it is a sexual encounter between Dimmesdale and Hester. Rita K. Goldin is able to draw a line of demarcation between the function of the daydream in the life of two main protagonists in the Scarlet Letter. Hester's daydream establishes her character and Dimmesdale explores his dilemma. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Truth of Dreams, page number 141. Since Hawthorne's romance is not only a historical romance but a psychological romance as well, the writer has made a judicious use of dreams in order to portray the inner reality of protagonist's mind. Lionel Trilling draws our attention to the similarity between Hawthorne and Kafka. There is very considerable degree of similarity in their preoccupations. Man's Dark Odyssey in an alien world may serve to describe Kafka's as well as Hawthorne's. Hawthorne in our time from beyond culture. Lionel Trilling also points out then too, having in mind Kafka's negation of the world of actuality, I think it can fairly be said there is something comparable in the way that Hawthorne deals with the world. He encourages the comparison when he tells us that he does not write novels but romances, but which he means that his fiction does not make a very determined reference to the concrete substantialities of life, the observation and imitation of which is the definitive business of novels. We would like you to remember the key phrase negation of the world of actuality that is at the heart of Hawthorne's creativity in the Scarlet Letter. Terence Martin has drawn our attention to the ambivalent nature of reality portrayed in Hawthorne's masterpiece. In the Scarlet Letter, however, Hawthorne sustains a vision of the ambivalent nature of reality beyond all he had done before and in a way he was never to do again. Hester, Dimmesdale, Chillingworth, the Scarlet Letter itself all signify more than one thing, all must be considered in more than one way. Nathaniel Hawthorne, while Terence Martin lays stress on many-sidedness of Hawthorne's somber tale, Christine Herjog lays stress on the subaltern and the marginal groups that fill the canvas in the Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter is a story set up at the rough edge of civilization. The dark forest is still ominously near, and the dark dangers from foreign servants, untamed children, stubborn heretics, ideal Indians, or hell-bound witches seem to threaten the Puritan civilization's sacred new orders, that is women, ethnics and exotics. If we want to appreciate the extraordinary richness of the text, you have to keep in mind not only the Puritan ethos but also the voice of the subaltern and marginal groups, that is the Indians, the witches, the Quakers and heretics. There is indeed a polyphony of voices in the Scarlet Letter. Christine Herjog has rightly affirmed American literature gained strength whenever it drew on the power of the powerless. George Decker lays emphasis on the fact that the American historical romance is a genre that shows a preoccupation with the past. He is of the view that there are time and place markers in the Scarlet Letter, and when we look at the character like Governor Bellingham, he appears as an anachronistic figure to the readers of our time. The American Historical Romance, page number 15. Luther S. Lutic is of the view the problem of the Scarlet Letter is really the problem of how to interpret Hester, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Romance of the Orient, page 165. In other words, the real significance of the Scarlet Letter lies in our ability to look at the pagan and oriental nature of Hester, and also in our ability to look upon her as most of a radical women of 19th century American fiction. Nina Bem is also of the view that Hester is the core of the romance, not Dimmesdale. Charles Swan is nearly of the same view. She is genuinely subversive in that she desires and prophesies a radical subversion of the patriarchal structures of the society and most significantly of the religion that legitimates that patriarchy. That is Nathaniel Hawthorne, Tradition and Revolution, page 90 to 91. He is also of the view that the narrative form regists closer. It remains deliberately open to the future. Charles Swan sums up his evaluation of Hawthorne's masterpiece in these words: The Scarlet Letter is a historical novel, one which takes past, present and future into consideration. and is at the same time political, in that figure is presented as something that we have to struggle to make a marking based on desire, corrected by our perspectives on the past. Sackman Borkovich lays stress on the gaps and silences in the text, and we do not really understand why Hester Prynne returns to Boston after Paul's settlement in the Old World. He is also of the view that Hawthorne's imagination has something of Bakhtin's dialogic imagination. Berkovich says dialogics is the process by which a singular authorial vision unfolds as a polyphony of distinct voices. The Office of the Scarlet Letter, page 24. Michael Dunne also draws our attention towards open-endedness of the text of the Scarlet Letter. Hawthorne's narrative strategies, page 19. There is no wonder that the reader has to read the text with utmost care and judgment. If one were to sum up the contemporary relevance of the Scarlet Letter, one could do no better than quote Nina Bam. Perhaps then the most exciting thing about the Scarlet Letter is not that we can translate it into a core meaning, but it is full of meanings. Though a dead work, if it is not read, it comes to life for each reader in a slightly different way, just as human beings do for each other. The elusiveness of the text is thus the essential reason for its continuous fascination throughout the years. Then let us sum up. In the 19th century, the Scarlet Letter was evaluated in terms of a realistic work of fiction. As such, critics felt that there was an excess of allegory and symbolism in the romantic tale. It was in the 20th century that the Scarlet Letter was evaluated in terms of its structure based on sequence of the three scaffold scenes that encompassed the romantic scenes in the forest. It was also seen as a romantic novel in which allegory and symbolism played such a crucial role. The contemporary critics could discern a kind of dialogic imagination informing the text. The past and the future were embedded in the text inextricably. Each reader has to recreate the text in the light of his or her own experience, keeping in mind both the dominant voice and also the voice of the subaltern marginal groups in colonial New England. Then glossary. Dialogic imagination is a key concept developed by Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin. It enables a writer to present more or less simultaneously concepts which were opposites and could not be reconciled in terms of reason. Novels using this technique use multiple voices called polyphony. The Scarlet Letter brings out the opposing views of Dimmesdale and Hester on their sexual union. Then a select bibliography. Here it is some bibliography, that is Critics and Hawthorne, that is Thomas J. Rowntree, Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Truth of Dreams by Rita K. Golin, Hawthorne in Our Time by Lionel Trilling, then Nathaniel Hawthorne by Terence Martin, Women, Ethnics, Aesthetics by Christine Herzog, Hawthorne as a Poet by G. Singh, The Scarlet Letter, a reading by Nina Bam, The American Novel and Its Tradition by Richard Chase, The Scarlet Letter, Norton Critical Edition 1988. So, this is all about block 2, The Critical Perspective of the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So, thank you viewers.